Turn off the backup generators now, or this entire base goes blind in 6 minutes. Claire Sullivan's voice was quiet, but it cut through the darkness more sharply than the failing alarm. No one answered her. Inside the underground command center at Fort Blackridge, screens flickered like dying stars before collapsing into black. The overhead lights had vanished 30 seconds earlier. Emergency strips along the floor glowed weakly, painting the room in thin red lines. Somewhere behind the walls, a relay clicked 3 times, paused, then clicked twice more. Claire stopped breathing for half a second. That rhythm was wrong. Around her, officers shouted over one another, boots struck metal flooring, and radios released bursts of broken static. Major Grant Keller stood at the center console, his face lit by the pale beam of a handheld flashlight. "Restart auxiliary power," he ordered. "Bring every generator online." Claire moved closer. She wore gray work coveralls with no rank, no ribbons, and no sign that anyone in the room should listen to her. A small tool pouch rested against her hip. Rainwater still darkened the shoulders of her jacket from the walk across the maintenance yard. "Major, do not synchronize the generators," she said. "The backup grid is feeding against the primary loop. If you force them together, you'll burn out the last working relays." Keller turned toward her as if noticing her for the first time. "Who let maintenance into command?" One of the younger officers aimed his flashlight at Claire. "That's Sullivan, contract technician." Keller's jaw tightened. "Then she needs to return to the service corridor and wait for instructions." A synthetic voice emerged from the final active speaker. "External sensor network unavailable. Perimeter visibility loss estimated in 5 minutes, 42 seconds. The room fell quiet for 1 heartbeat. Then the shouting returned, louder than before. Claire looked past them toward the darkened status wall. She did not need the screens. She could hear the fault traveling through the base. The ventilation fans were slowing unevenly. The eastern relay bank was humming half a note too low. Beneath the floor, current moved through the wrong line, searching for somewhere to discharge. She placed 2 fingers against the nearest steel panel. A faint vibration traveled into her hand. 3 pulses. A gap. 2 pulses. The same pattern. Keller raised the radio. "Engineering, initiate full auxiliary restart." Claire's eyes lifted. "That order will finish what the outage started." He stared at her. "You're just a technician." She did not argue. She did not explain her credentials or raise her voice. She simply crossed the room, opened the small pouch at her side, and removed an old insulated screwdriver marked with 6 narrow lines. The last emergency display flashed once. "Perimeter visibility loss in 5 minutes." Claire turned toward the sealed power cabinet. "Then we have less than 5 minutes to stop listening to the computers." 18 hours earlier, Fort Blackridge had looked unshakable beneath a clear Colorado morning. Radar dishes turned slowly above the northern ridge. Armored service doors opened with hydraulic precision, and rows of green status lights glowed across the maintenance building. Claire Sullivan arrived before sunrise in a faded utility truck pulling a small horse trailer. When she lowered the ramp, Maverick stepped onto the gravel with the steady caution of a creature that trusted the woman beside him more than the unfamiliar ground beneath his hooves. The white woman wore plain gray coveralls, weathered work boots, and a brown jacket with a stitched contractor badge above the pocket. Her dark brown hair was tied low at the back of her neck. No medals decorated her chest. No rank marked her shoulders. She led the Mustang toward the temporary stable near the western fence, checked his water, then rested one hand against his neck until his breathing settled. "It will be a quiet day," she said softly. Maverick flicked one ear toward the underground power station. Claire noticed, but she said nothing. At 7 o'clock, Major Grant Keller gathered the engineering staff inside the primary control room for a scheduled defense readiness inspection. Colonel Nathan Cole stood near the central display with several senior officers, while younger technicians lined the walls holding tablets and diagnostic tools. Claire entered carrying a metal case marked for relay testing. Keller glanced at her contractor badge and pointed toward the rear workbench. "Set your equipment there. Our engineers will tell you what they need." Claire placed the case down without objection. The briefing began with charts, percentages, and confident assurances. Every major system displayed green. Backup power showed full capacity. External sensors reported no faults. Keller spoke with the certainty of a man who trusted every number on the wall. Halfway through the inspection, Claire heard a faint vibration beneath the polished floor. It lasted less than 2 seconds. No one else reacted. She lowered her eyes toward the northern conduit channel. A moment later, the vibration returned. 3 pulses, a pause, then 2. Claire opened her case and removed a handheld meter, but Keller stopped speaking and looked directly at her. "Is there a problem?" "I would like to inspect the north transfer line," Claire said. The secondary grid may be cycling out of phase. A few engineers exchanged amused looks. One young lieutenant checked the nearest screen. "The system reports normal synchronization." Keller gestured toward the glowing display. "There is your answer." Claire studied the numbers. The display is averaging the signal. It may be hiding a short, irregular cycle. Keller gave a patient smile meant for someone he had already dismissed. "Miss Sullivan handles physical maintenance. She is here for cable access and relay replacement, not systems analysis." A quiet laugh moved through the room. Claire closed the meter case. She did not defend herself. She only looked through the narrow window toward the western fence, where Maverick had turned his head toward the buried power lines. The Mustang stood perfectly still, ears forward, listening to something the computers had decided was not there. Claire waited until the inspection group moved toward the communications wing before she returned to the north transfer corridor. The passage ran beneath the maintenance yard, nearly 60 feet below the surface, where the air smelled of cold concrete, machine, oil, and copper warmed by steady current. She carried no tablet. Instead, she brought the old insulated screwdriver, a compact meter, and a paper notebook with a worn black cover. Digital records could tell her what the system believed. The walls could tell her what the system was actually doing. She stopped at the first junction box and placed her palm against the metal. The vibration was faint but unmistakable. 3 pulses. Silence. 2 more. She checked the voltage. The reading appeared normal. She waited through another cycle and watched the needle dip for less than half a second before recovering. A modern diagnostic program would smooth that interruption into an acceptable average. Claire wrote down the time, the temperature, and the interval between pulses. Then she followed the buried line north. Above ground, Maverick began pacing inside the temporary stable. His hooves struck the packed earth in the same uneven pattern. 3 steps. A pause. 2 steps. The stable attendant, a civilian named Nora Bell, tried to calm him with a handful of oats, but the Mustang ignored the food and kept facing the northern fence. When Claire emerged from the corridor, Maverick lifted his head immediately. She crossed the yard and stood beside him. "You hear it too," she murmured. His ears remained fixed toward the ridge. Claire laid 2 fingers against the wooden rail. A weak tremor traveled through the ground. It was not loud enough to frighten most horses, but Maverick had spent years learning the difference between harmless noise and machinery under strain. Claire opened her notebook and drew a simple line connecting the stable, the northern conduit, and Ridge 7. The buried transfer cable passed directly beneath all 3 points. Lieutenant Owen Price approached with a tablet tucked under one arm. He had been among the engineers who laughed during the briefing, though his expression now carried more curiosity than amusement. "Are you taking maintenance advice from your horse?" he asked. Claire kept watching Maverick. "I'm taking information from every reliable source." Price glanced at the Mustang, then at her notebook. The grid monitor still shows normal output. Normal output does not mean stable timing. She handed him the compact meter. "Hold this against the rail and wait." He did. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the needle dipped. 3 pulses came through the wood, followed by a pause, and 2 more. Price's smile disappeared. Claire pointed toward Ridge 7, 5 miles beyond the fence. Dark clouds were gathering over the mountains, even though the morning forecast had promised clear skies until evening. "The backup grid is trying to correct a problem that the primary grid has not admitted exists," she said. When the weather reaches that ridge, both systems may attempt control at the same time. Price looked down at the stable tablet. What happens then? Claire closed her notebook. The base will trust whichever system speaks louder. That may not be the one telling the truth. Lieutenant Owen Price followed Claire back toward the primary control room, carrying the compact meter as though its small needle had unsettled something much larger than the power line beneath the stable. By the time they entered, Major Grant Keller had resumed the readiness inspection with Colonel Nathan Cole and the senior officers. A map of Fort Blackridge filled the main display, every sector marked green, every generator listed as available, every external sensor reporting full function. Keller paused when he saw Price beside Claire. "Why are you away from your station?" he asked. Price held up the meter. "Sir, there's an irregular pulse in the north transfer line. Miss Sullivan found it below the maintenance yard. I confirmed the pattern at the stable." Several engineers turned toward them. Keller looked at the meter, then at the digital status wall. "The grid is operating within approved limits." Claire stepped forward and placed her notebook on the console. "The output is within limits because the software is averaging the readings. The timing is not stable. The primary and secondary systems are correcting against each other." Keller opened the notebook, glanced at the hand-drawn lines, and closed it again. "We have military diagnostic equipment worth several $1,000,000, and you are asking me to interrupt an inspection because of a vibration in a fence." A young systems engineer near the communications panel smiled. "Maybe the Mustang has higher clearance than we do." Quiet laughter moved across the room. Price lowered his eyes, but Claire remained still. "Today, he may be listening more carefully than the software," she said. The laughter faded, not because anyone believed her, but because she had answered without embarrassment. Keller folded his arms. "What exactly are you recommending?" "Separate the north transfer line from automatic control. Run the backup generators independently until the phase cycle is inspected at Ridge 7. The room became serious. Disabling automatic synchronization during a readiness inspection would require a written report, a delay, and an explanation to regional command. Keller looked toward the mountain feed on the weather display. Dark clouds had begun gathering 20 miles west, but the forecast still showed the storm arriving after sunset. "You want me to reduce operational efficiency based on a mechanical tremor that no internal sensor recognizes. I want you to prevent two healthy systems from becoming one failed system." Colonel Cole studied Claire from across the room. His attention moved from her calm expression to the 6 narrow marks carved into the handle of her old screwdriver. For a moment, he appeared ready to ask a question, but Keller spoke first. "Request denied. Continue the inspection." Claire picked up her notebook, then recorded that the warning was given before the weather reached the ridge. Keller's face tightened. "Return to maintenance." She turned without another word. As she reached the door, every green light on the north section of the display flickered at the same time. It lasted less than 1 second. Most people assumed it was a screen refresh. Claire did not look back. Outside, beyond the thick concrete walls, Maverick struck the ground 3 times, waited, then struck it twice more. The storm reached Fort Blackridge 4 hours earlier than forecast. By late afternoon, the western sky had turned the color of cooled steel, and wind pressed against the maintenance buildings and lawn. Steady waves. Claire stood beneath the stable roof, while Maverick watched the mountains. He was not frightened by thunder. He had crossed open country through worse weather than this. What held his attention was the ground. The Mustang lowered his head, then lifted it sharply as another tremor passed beneath the yard. 3 pulses. A pause. 2 more. Claire checked her watch. The interval had shortened by 11 seconds. Lieutenant Owen Price found her near the north fence, rain beginning to strike his uniform. "The control room says the grid is stable," he said. The north line flickered again, but the software corrected it. Claire looked toward Ridge 7, nearly 5 miles away and already disappearing behind rain. The software did not correct anything. It hid the disagreement. A low mechanical hum rose from beneath the base. For 1 second, the stable lights brightened beyond their normal level. Then they returned to normal. Claire moved immediately. "Tell Keller to isolate the secondary grid." Price reached for his radio. Before he could speak, every light in the stable went out. The darkness arrived without warning. Maverick remained still beside Claire, his breathing steady against her shoulder. Across the yard, emergency lamps came on in scattered windows. A siren began to sound from the underground command entrance, but the tone broke apart after 3 uneven notes. Price stared toward the mountains. There was no lightning. I know. The first thunder came several seconds later, rolling across the ridge after the base had already lost power. Claire closed her eyes and listened. The primary generators were shutting down in sequence, exactly as designed. Beneath them, the auxiliary system tried to rise, hesitated, and fell back. They tried again. 2 systems were competing for control, each reading the other as a fault. Price's radio released a burst of static. Major Keller's voice came through in fragments. All engineering personnel report to command. Prepare full auxiliary restart. Claire took the radio from Price. Major, do not bring the generators online together. The outage began before the storm reached the ridge. This is a synchronization failure. Keller answered after a pause. Return that radio to Lieutenant Price and report to maintenance. The weather did not cause the first failure. The base lost power during a storm. We do not have time for theories. Claire looked across the dark yard. One emergency light after another was fading as local batteries drained. Then listen to the timing. The backup grid is restarting every 27 seconds. The primary loop is rejecting it every 27 seconds. If you force a full connection, the remaining relays will fail together. Static swallowed the channel. Price took back the radio, but his eyes remained on Claire. From deep beneath the ground came a heavy click, followed by a second, weaker one. The auxiliary generators began to rise. Claire opened her tool pouch and removed the screwdriver marked with 6 narrow lines. He gave the restart order, Price said. Claire turned toward the underground access stairs. Then we have 27 seconds before the system makes the same mistake again. Claire reached the underground access door with Lieutenant Owen Price close behind her. The magnetic lock had failed with the main grid, so she opened the manual panel and turned the release with her old screwdriver. The heavy door moved only a few inches before stopping. Price pulled beside her, and together they forced it wide enough to enter. Inside, the corridor was lit by thin red emergency strips along the floor. The air felt warmer than it should have. Somewhere below them, the auxiliary generators gathered speed, then dropped, then gathered speed again. Claire counted the intervals without looking at her watch. 27 seconds. The same cycle. Price raised his flashlight. The control room is 2 levels down. The transfer chamber is closer, Claire said. If Keller completes the restart before we reach command, the last relay bank will lock itself open. They moved through the dark passage, following the sound of metal contacts striking out of sequence. At the transfer chamber, Claire opened the outer cabinet and found 3 indicator lamps still glowing. 2 were green, 1 pulsed amber. The colors looked reassuring, but the metal behind the panel told a different story. She pressed the back of her hand against the housing and felt the heat building inside. Price checked his tablet, but the screen showed only a frozen diagram. The system still lists this section as stable. Claire removed the panel cover. The system is reporting what it was told to expect. A deep hum rolled through the chamber. The generators began another synchronization attempt. Claire traced the cables by touch, moving past the labeled controls toward a narrow manual cutoff that had not been used in years. Price saw what she was reaching for. That switch isolates command from the full auxiliary grid. It also saves the relay bank. Major Keller did not authorize isolation. Claire looked at him. Her face remained calm, but her voice carried no uncertainty. In 12 seconds, authorization will not matter. Price listened to the rising hum. What happens to the control room? It keeps emergency lighting, 1 internal radio channel, and ventilation. Everything else goes dark. And if you are wrong, then Keller will have a simple reason to remove me from a base. The amber lamp began flashing faster. Claire wrapped one hand around the cutoff lever. Over the radio, Keller's voice broke through the static. Engineering, prepare for full connection on my count. Price lifted his radio. Sir, wait. Sullivan found heat in the North Transfer Bank. Keller answered immediately. Do not touch the manual controls. Claire watched the lamp. 5 seconds. 4. 3. Keller began, counting from command. Claire pulled the lever down before he reached 1. The chamber went completely silent. Every remaining light disappeared. For one long moment, Fort Blackridge seemed to stop breathing. Then a single ventilation fan began turning somewhere in the darkness. A red emergency strip flickered back to life. Price's radio crackled. Voices from command reported that the relay temperature was falling. Claire rested her hand against the cabinet. The dangerous vibration was gone. Keller's voice returned, controlled but furious. Miss Sullivan, you directly disobeyed an order. Claire closed the panel and picked up her flashlight. Yes, Major. Report to command immediately. She looked toward the lower corridor. From far beneath the base came a new sound, quieter than the generators and more troubling. A repeating digital tone. Claire had heard it before, years ago, in another facility that no longer appeared on public maps. We have a larger problem, she said. Price turned toward her. What kind of problem? Claire listened as the tone repeated. The power failure did not lock the system out. Something inside the network told it to lock itself. Claire and Lieutenant Owen Price entered the command center through the lower service passage, where the emergency lights cast narrow red bands across the floor. The room no longer sounded chaotic. The darkness had changed the officers. Voices were lower now, stripped of confidence, and every order seemed to wait for confirmation from equipment that no longer answered. Major Grant Keller stood beside the central console with a flashlight in one hand and a radio in the other. Colonel Nathan Cole remained near the status wall, studying the few lines of text still visible on an isolated battery display. Keller turned as Claire approached. You cut auxiliary power without authorization. I isolated a failing transfer bank, Claire replied. The relay temperature is dropping. That does not change the order you ignored. Price stepped forward. Sir, the housing was overheating. The full connection would have damaged the remaining relays. Keller looked at him with clear disappointment. You are not helping her by repeating speculation. Claire set her tool pouch on the edge of the console. It is no longer speculation. The shutdown command came from inside the defense network. Colonel Cole looked away from the status wall. Explain. Claire pointed toward the faint digital tone repeating through a nearby speaker. That tone is a continuity rejection signal. The system believes one of its own protected sectors is unauthorized. It is isolating power, communications, and sensors in stages. Keller shook his head. Blackridge does not use that protocol. It does, Claire said. It was buried beneath the modern control layer when this facility was upgraded. The room became still. Colonel Cole stepped closer. How would a contract technician know what was buried beneath a classified control layer? Claire did not answer immediately. She opened the nearest maintenance panel and shined her flashlight inside. Several cables disappeared into the darkness behind the console. She selected one without checking the labels, followed it by touch, and disconnected a small feedback module. The repeating tone stopped. One ventilation fan increased speed. A single internal radio channel cleared. An officer across the room lifted his headset. Command communications are back. Keller stared at the panel. How did you know which module to remove? Claire replaced the cover. Because the rejection signal always returns through the shortest protected route. Always. Colonel Cole repeated. His flashlight moved across her hand and settled on the old insulated screwdriver. 6 narrow marks had been carved into the handle with deliberate spacing. His expression changed. Years earlier, while reviewing emergency procedures from a restricted continuity program, he had seen those same marks beside diagrams no current engineer could fully explain. 6 lines meant the circuit had been rebuilt by hand under field conditions. It also identified the operator responsible for the design. Cole reached for the screwdriver, but Claire closed her fingers around it before he could touch it. Where did you get that? He asked. It belonged to someone who taught me to listen before trusting a screen. What was that person's name? Claire looked toward the dark status wall. He did not live long enough to place it in the manual. Keller exhaled impatiently. Colonel, we are wasting time. Cole did not look away from Claire. No, Major. I believe we have been wasting time since this morning. A weak signal appeared on the battery display. Ridge 7 had entered critical reserve. Estimated power loss, 31 minutes. Claire read the message once, then reached for her tool pouch. That is where the lockout began, she said. And if Ridge 7 goes dark, this base disappears with it. The battery display dimmed as Ridge 7 entered emergency reserve. 31 minutes. Colonel Nathan Cole turned toward the operations map, but the digital route overlays had disappeared with the main network. Major Grant Keller unfolded a paper service map across the console and aimed his flashlight at the northern access road. We send a repair vehicle now, he said. Lieutenant Owen Price checked the last working weather channel. The north road is blocked near mile marker 3. A tree came down across both lanes, and runoff is washing gravel from the shoulder. Keller moved his finger to the eastern route, then used the ridge road. The gate controls are offline, Price replied. Even if we open them manually, that road climbs more than 2,000 feet in less than 4 miles. The maintenance trucks will not make it through the mud before reserve power fails. Another message appeared on the display. 29 minutes. Claire studied the map for only a moment. Then she looked past it toward the dark ceiling, listening to the wind moving through the ventilation shafts. There's an older trail from the western stable to Ridge 7, she said. Keller gave her a hard look. That trail was removed from the base maps years ago. It was removed from the digital maps. The trail is still there. Colonel Cole watched her carefully. Can a vehicle use it? No. Then how do you plan to reach the station? Claire closed her tool pouch. Maverick. Keller stared at her, as though the answer were too simple to take seriously. You intend to ride a horse through a mountain storm carrying electrical equipment. The trail is less than 5 miles. He knows uneven ground, and he will not depend on an engine, a satellite, or a control system. Thunder rolled across the base. The emergency display dropped to 27 minutes. Cole looked at the faded topographic lines on the paper map. The western trail crossed a narrow slope, passed an abandoned observation post, and climbed directly toward Ridge 7. It was the shortest route. It was also the only route untouched by the failed gates and blocked roads. What do you need? He asked. Claire answered without hesitation. A portable analogue radio. Insulated cable, 2 manual fuses, a grounding strap, and access to the sealed continuity cabinet at Ridge 7. Keller stepped between her and the exit. That cabinet is restricted. She does not have clearance. Cole kept his eyes on Claire. Do you know how to open it? Yes. Ow! The lock was designed to work after every electronic credential failed. The colonel was silent for 1 second. Then he removed a small brass key from the chain beneath his uniform and placed it in her palm. Keller's expression changed. Colonel, that key belongs to Continuity Command. And Continuity Command currently has no system to command. Claire closed her fingers around the key. Price gathered the requested equipment into a weatherproof bag. As they crossed the yard, rain struck the concrete in silver sheets. Maverick stood beneath the stable roof, alert but calm, already facing the northern ridge. Claire secured the equipment behind the saddle, checked each strap twice, then placed one hand against the Mustang's neck. His breathing matched hers within seconds. Price raised the radio. Ridge 7 reserve is at 24 minutes. Claire mounted without ceremony. Colonel Cole stood in the rain near the stable entrance. Can you restore it in time? She looked toward the mountain, where the trail had vanished into darkness. I can reach it in time, she said. What happens after that depends on what the system has been trying to hide. Maverick stepped into the storm, found the old trail beneath the mud, and began climbing. Maverick climbed through the storm with the careful certainty of an animal that trusted the ground more than the sky. Rain swept across the western trail in cold sheets, turning the narrow path into dark mud between exposed roots and granite. Claire kept one hand low on the reins and the other near the weatherproof equipment bag behind the saddle. She did not urge the Mustang faster. Speed meant nothing if one careless step sent them back down the slope. The portable radio at her shoulder broke through the wind. Ridge 7 reserve is at 19 minutes, Lieutenant Owen Price reported. The station is no longer answering automated checks. Claire pressed the transmit switch. Stop sending automated requests. Each one may be accelerating the lockout. Understood. Colonel Cole asked for your position. She looked toward the broken outline of an abandoned observation post above them. 2 miles from the station. The lower trail is holding. Static filled the channel, followed by Major Grant Keller's voice. Sullivan, we need confirmation that the station can be restored before reserve power reaches 0. Claire guided Maverick around a fallen pine. I cannot confirm a repair before I see the fault. Then tell us the probability. A number will not change the work. Keller started to answer, but Colonel Cole interrupted. Continue to Ridge 7. We will keep the channel clear. Claire released the radio. Thunder crossed the mountain, and white light spread across the clouds without touching the earth. For an instant, the trail ahead looked like another road from another time. Her fingers tightened around the reins. Years earlier, she had crossed a different ridge beneath a sky with no stars, carrying a field transmitter while 6 operators waited in a buried control room for power that would not return on its own. The unit had been called Night Lantern because they restored guidance and communication where maps ended and darkness became part of the mission. Their work had never looked heroic. It had sounded like relays clicking, batteries warming, and tired voices repeating coordinates until morning. On the final night, the main network had begun rejecting its own protected stations. The screens had shown green, while the cables beneath the floor heated toward failure. Claire had heard the warning pattern before anyone else. 3 pulses. A pause. 2 more. Her instructor, Daniel Mercer, had placed the old insulated screwdriver in her hand and told her that machines rarely failed without speaking first. People simply preferred displays to uncomfortable sounds. They had rebuilt the continuity circuit by touch, marking each completed line into the screwdriver handle. 1 line for power, 1 for communications, 1 for navigation, 1 for identification, 1 for external sensors. The 6th mark had been added at dawn, after Claire restored the final connection alone. The official report later reduced the entire night to a technical interruption. It did not include Mercer's last lesson or the empty chair beside the console when the lights returned. Maverick slowed beneath her. Claire opened her eyes fully and realized the Mustang had stopped at the edge of a washed-out section of trail. Water rushed through a gap nearly 6 feet wide. The old wooden crossing had collapsed into the ravine below. Reserve is at 14 minutes, Price said through the radio. Claire studied the slope, the rocks, and a narrow line of ground rising above the damaged trail. It was steep but firm. She leaned forward and rested her palm against Maverick's neck. You choose the ground, she whispered. The Mustang turned away from the broken crossing and began climbing where no road appeared on any map. Behind them, Fort Blackridge remained dark. Ahead, through the rain, a single red light blinked once from Ridge 7 and disappeared. Maverick reached Ridge 7 with 12 minutes of reserve power remaining. The relay station stood against the mountain like a dark concrete box, its antenna mast barely visible through the rain. Claire dismounted before the Mustang had fully stopped, secured his reins beneath the narrow overhang, and removed the weatherproof equipment bag. The outer door had no power, but Colonel Nathan Cole's brass key turned the mechanical lock. Inside, the air was colder than expected. A single red lamp blinked above the continuity cabinet, then faded. Claire switched on her flashlight and moved past the modern control racks without touching them. Their displays were dark, yet one processor continued producing a faint, repeating tone. 3 pulses. A pause. 2 more. She opened the sealed cabinet and found an older system hidden behind the newer panels, protected by metal shielding and manual switches. The design was familiar. Too familiar. I am inside Ridge 7, she said into the portable radio. Lieutenant Owen Price answered through heavy static. Reserve power is at 10 minutes. Command is ready for your restart. Claire examined the signal paths with a compact meta. The primary feed was stable. The backup batteries still held enough charge. Nothing inside the station had physically failed. Then she tested the identification circuit. The needle jumped in the wrong direction. Claire repeated the test, slower this time. The result did not change. "Do not prepare for a full restart," she said. Major Grant Keller came onto the channel. "We have already completed the sequence. Once you restore the station, we will bring the entire network online." "Cancel it." "Sullivan, we do not have time to rebuild the plan." Claire removed a small access plate and traced the wiring beneath it. A newer identification module had been connected to the old continuity system during the last upgrade. Its security logic was reading Fort Blackridge as an unverified external site. The outage had not confused the network. The network was following its instructions exactly. "The identification layer is corrupted," Claire said. "If you restore every system at once, the defense network will classify the base as unauthorized." Silence filled the radio. Colonel Cole spoke next. "What would that mean in practical terms?" "Communications would remain blocked. External sensors would reject command signals. Automated safeguards would isolate the base more aggressively than they already have." Keller's voice hardened. "Can you prove that from one station?" Claire connected the meter across 2 terminals. The needle moved sharply, matching the rejection tone. "I can prove that Ridge 7 is receiving a valid request from Blackridge and labeling it hostile to the network." The words settled heavily across the channel. Price asked, "Can you remove the corrupted module?" "Not safely while the modern system is connected. The station must be restored in layers." The reserve warning sounded once. 8 minutes. Keller exhaled. "We do not have enough time for a layered recovery." Claire looked at the 6 marks carved into her screwdriver. "A full restart takes less time because it ignores the problem. That does not make it faster. It makes it final." Colonel Cole answered without hesitation. "What is the correct order?" Claire opened the continuity cabinet completely. Inside were 6 manual circuits, each tied to a separate function. Power, internal communications, passive radar, identification, external sensors, main defense control. The sequence had not changed since Night Lantern. Only the labels were newer. "I will restore power first, then internal communications. After that, I will separate identification from the rest of the network and test every section before reconnecting it." "How long?" Cole asked. Claire watched the reserve clock drop to 7 minutes. "Longer than we have if anyone interrupts the sequence." Keller began to object, but Cole cut him off. "All personnel will follow Sullivan's instructions." Claire set the radio beside the cabinet and removed the grounding strap. Outside, Maverick stood quietly beneath the overhang while rain moved across the mountain. Inside Ridge 7, Claire placed the old screwdriver against the first manual terminal. "Blackridge, this is Ridge 7, she said. "From this moment forward, do not turn anything on unless I tell you." Claire fastened the grounding strap to the cabinet frame and touched the first manual terminal with the insulated screwdriver. A low current moved through the metal, weak but steady. "Blackridge, confirm all auxiliary commands are suspended," she said. Lieutenant Owen Price answered at once. "Confirmed. No systems will be activated without your instruction." Claire turned the first switch. The station lights did not return, but a small analog gauge rose from 0. "Power layer is stable. Prepare internal communications only." At Fort Blackridge, Colonel Nathan Cole repeated the order, and a single communications circuit came alive beneath the command center. Claire heard the channel clear. The static softened. Then the old continuity cabinet produced a sound that had not been heard at Ridge 7 in years. A mechanical chime rang once, followed by a flat synthetic voice. "Manual continuity access detected. State authorization." Major Grant Keller spoke over the radio. "Use the command key." "The key opens the cabinet," Claire replied. "It does not authorize the sequence." She removed her glove and placed her hand against a narrow metal plate hidden beneath the first row of switches. The surface was cold. A pale light passed beneath her palm. "Voice authentication required," the system said. The reserve warning showed 4 minutes. Claire looked at the 6 marked circuits. She had hoped the old system would accept the repair without asking who she was. It did not. Colonel Cole's voice came quietly through the radio. "Miss Sullivan, whatever it needs, give it." Claire leaned toward the cabinet microphone. Continuity, Operator Sullivan. Manual restoration request. The system paused. Rain struck the station roof. Maverick shifted once outside, then became still again. Voice pattern recognized. The cabinet announced. Archived operational record located. In the command center, Price looked toward Colonel Cole. Major Keller stopped moving. The synthetic voice continued. Night Lantern continuity operator confirmed. Field authority level 6. Claire closed her eyes for 1 second. The next words came with the same emotionless precision. Call sign, Lantern 6. No one at Fort Blackridge spoke. Colonel Cole remembered the restricted reports he had studied early in his career, reports about an emergency communications unit that entered disabled defense sites after every normal system had failed. Night Lantern had restored navigation corridors, protected evacuation routes, and rebuilt command networks under conditions the official summaries described only as severe. Most names had been removed. One designation remained in every successful recovery file. Lantern 6. Keller finally found his voice. That program was dissolved more than a decade ago. Claire connected the second circuit. Programs end. Failure patterns do not. The internal communications gauge rose into the safe range. Blackridge, activate local communications now. Price followed her instruction. Across the base, radios cleared one section at a time. Voices returned from a medical station, the western gate, and the underground maintenance levels. The system spoke again. Operator status inactive. Reactivation required for Defense Continuity Authority. Claire stared at the authorization plate. Accepting would reopen a record she had spent years leaving behind. The reserve clock dropped below 3 minutes. Colonel Cole understood the silence. Claire, he said, using her first name for the first time, this base does not need your history. It needs your judgment. She looked at the screwdriver Daniel Mercer had placed in her hand long ago. Then she pressed her palm firmly against the plate. Reactivate Continuity Authority. The cabinet light changed from amber to white. Lantern 6 restored. Claire moved to the third circuit. Begin passive radar preparation, she ordered. At Fort Blackridge, every officer who had called her a contractor now waited for her next word. Claire moved the third manual switch into position. Blackridge, activate passive radar only. Do not connect identification. Lieutenant Owen Price repeated the instruction to the control room team. For several seconds, nothing changed. Then one dark monitor awakened with a thin green line sweeping across its surface. A second display followed. The radar showed the mountain, the access roads, and the empty airspace above Fort Blackridge, but every return remained isolated from the corrupted identification layer. Passive radar is stable, Price reported. No false contacts. Claire watched the analog gauge at Ridge 7. The needle held steady. Good. Prepare external sensors by sector. Western perimeter first. Major Grant Keller stood beside the command console, no longer giving orders. He listened as Claire restored the base one section at a time. The western sensors returned. Then the southern fence. Then the eastern service road. Each circuit came online only after Claire tested the signal path and confirmed that the corrupted module could not reach it. The reserve clock reached 1 minute, but the first restored power layer began charging the station batteries before they reached 0. The warning tone stopped. Claire allowed herself one slow breath. Ridge 7 reserve is recovering, Price said. You did it. Not yet. Claire opened the identification housing and removed the newer security module from its connection to the continuity system. The small device looked undamaged. That was what made it dangerous. Its programming had accepted a false command and followed it perfectly. Claire connected an isolated test line. Send one local identification request from Blackridge. Price transmitted the request. The module answered immediately, classifying the base as an unauthorized external site. Keller stared at the result on the command display. The entire shutdown came from that unit. The shutdown came from trusting it without verification, Claire replied. She disconnected the module completely and rebuilt the identification path through the older manual circuit. Colonel Cole, I need a command confirmation. Cole placed his hand on the restored console. Fort Blackridge command confirmed. Claire turned the fourth switch. The system paused, tested the signal, then responded. Protected site recognized. Across the command center, status lights changed from red to amber. Claire moved to the fifth circuit. External sensors linked with radar. Weather stations returned. Gate cameras came online. The final switch remained untouched. Main defense control. Keller leaned toward the radio. Are we clear to restore the final layer? Claire checked every gauge again. Power was stable. Communications were clean. Radar showed no false returns. Identification recognized Blackridge correctly. External sensors were synchronized. Only then did she place the screwdriver against the sixth terminal. Clear, she said. Colonel Cole gave the order. Claire turned the final switch. At Ridge 7, the cabinet lights changed from white to green. At Fort Blackridge, the main display awakened in sections, spreading light across the command center. Ventilation returned to full speed. Radios cleared. Perimeter cameras appeared. The defense network rebuilt itself across the status wall, one verified connection at a time. A final message formed in bright green letters. Defense network restored. No one cheered. The room was too quiet for that. Keller looked at the glowing systems, then at the small radio carrying Claire's voice from 5 miles away. All layers stable, Price said. Colonel Cole lowered his flashlight. Lantern 6 confirmed status. Claire looked through the station. Doorway. Rain had softened, and Maverick waited beneath the overhang, calm and patient. Blackridge is secure, she replied. Now leave it alone long enough to listen. The storm weakened before dawn, leaving Fort Blackridge wrapped in cold mist and the steady hum of restored machinery. Claire waited until every gauge at Ridge 7 held within safe limits before she closed the continuity cabinet. She removed the grounding strap, placed the old screwdriver back in her tool pouch, and rested her hand on the metal door for one quiet moment. The green lights behind it no longer felt like victory. They felt like responsibility returned to its proper place. Outside, Maverick lifted his head as she approached. Rain had darkened his coat, but he stood calm beneath the overhang, ears forward, watching her as though he had never doubted she would come back out. Claire checked the saddle straps, secured the empty equipment bag, and guided him down the mountain as the first gray light appeared beyond the eastern ridge. By the time they reached the western gate, the roads had reopened and the base was fully awake. Soldiers, engineers, and civilian workers stood along the maintenance yard, not in formal formation, but in a silence that carried more weight than ceremony. Lieutenant Owen Price was the first to step forward. He took the weatherproof bag from the saddle and gave Claire a small nod. Every system is stable, he said. We ran 3 independent checks. Claire looked toward the control building. Run a 4th after the ground dries. Price smiled, but he did not laugh. Colonel Nathan Cole waited near the stable entrance with Major Grant Keller beside him. Cole raised one hand as Claire approached, beginning a formal salute. She shook her head once. The colonel understood. He lowered his hand and stood at attention instead. Keller looked older than he had the day before. The confidence that once filled his voice had been replaced by careful honesty. Miss Sullivan, he said, I ignored your warning, questioned your judgment, and treated your position as though it defined your ability. I was wrong. Claire removed Maverick's saddle slowly, allowing the Mustang to shift his weight after the long descent. Technician was never an insult, Major. Keller looked down. I made it sound like one. Yes, she said without anger. That single word carried no punishment, only truth. Colonel Cole glanced toward the command building, where the defense network now operated behind reinforced walls. Regional Command will want a full report. They will also want to know why Lantern 6 was working here under a civilian contract. Claire folded the saddle blanket and placed it over the rail. Tell them a technician noticed a fault and repaired it. That leaves out most of what happened. It leaves in the part that matters. Cole studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Around them, the people who had laughed the morning before returned quietly to their stations. No one asked Claire to explain Night Lantern. No one asked how many dark facilities she had walked into before this one. Some histories deserved respect without being reopened. Claire brushed rainwater from Maverick's neck and led him toward the stable as sunlight touched the radar dishes above the ridge. Behind her, Fort Blackridge watched the sky again. Ahead of her, the Mustang walked at an easy pace. Claire did not raise her voice, demand recognition, or wait for applause. She had restored the system, corrected the mistake, and returned to the work in front of her. Respect followed in silence.